And again, welcome. I'm Melanie Blake, the admin assistant for the association. Our presenter today is Sal Campagno, and he'll be telling you what he's going to be talking about. And again, Jim Hockenberry is going to help out with hosting because I have to head out in just a couple of minutes. Thanks again for joining us. And as I mentioned, we do have some events coming up. We have a special event on March 11th that's organized by Randy Gulke, the association's president, along with speakers throughout the spring. And Sal, I'll leave you to talk a little bit more about those at the end if you like. And for the moment, I'm going to turn it over to you, Sal. Please go ahead.
All right. Well, thanks to everyone. And I hope I have some good questions for this thing. I would have given this talk in January, but I had difficulties I can't go in through now. But I want to tell you, I talk about what happened 100 years ago and the effect of the war continuing through those years. And so I'm going to talk about last year, 1922, 100 years ago. And I just want to start off by talking about first two parts. The first part is about what happened here in the United States and in America. And then the second part is about what happened globally at that time, results of World War I. All right. One thing is the war has been over now for over close to 3 years, or 4 years if you want to push it. But it is interesting to note that when the war was over in officially in Europe on the 11th of November, 1918, the effect was almost immediate in America, that it went two ways. One, obviously, they were glad the whole thing was over with. And secondly, the beginning of a bitterness about the war. Now, I don't know why that happens after every kind of war America has been in, or I'm sure that's true for many countries. They feel something went wrong, should never have happened, and it's guilty that we were involved at all. And that had already been established. The ink wasn't even dry at, Compiègne, when they signed the, the end of the war, when that was already established here in America. One of the things about people about a war like ours that happened in World War I is they want to forget about it. And it didn't take long to do that. All these 4.5 million American soldiers that were in Europe, all they want to do was go home. But that was true for every army. I don't know about you, but when the German army was retreating from the Western Front, they were followed within 50 yards by a French army, pushing them further and further out of both France and Belgium until they got into the German line. All right. So let's go move on this point. Anyway, I'm going to start off by giving you the USA approach, and that is the 1920 census. There were 105.7 million Americans at that time in the United States. That's 105.7 million, 14 million, 1.4 million more than 1910. So we were increasing every year. We are over 330 million now. So each decade we are increasing in our growth here in America. And no sooner than it set in, then there were attempts to limit immigration to America. Now, this is one of the most untold stories I've never seemed to get over. Obviously, in most Americans, except the American Indians, were all products of immigration, whether it was forced in the form of slavery or whether it was voluntary. From 1870, 1910, 40 years, close to 35 million Europeans, I'm talking only about Europeans, came to the United States seeking either work, avoiding military. The largest immigrant group to America in that period, from 1870 to 1910, were Germans. More Germans came to America than any other immigrant group to this country. So most Americans can claim a lot of German blood in them. Now, the other item that got me is no sooner than that happened in 1910, which was the year the largest number actually ever came to America in immigration. was a reaction in the 20s to this immigration. But one of the most untold stories about it, and I don't know why it's never expressed about immigration, is how many went back. More than 1/3, almost half of all that 40 million or 35 million went back to their home countries. That's never expressed, it's never discussed. Why, I don't know. I know one thing about it personally because my grandfather went back and returned to his home country of Italy and went back there. And for one thing, there was other things that people think, another mistake, that the European immigrants all came through New York. Well, that's not true. There were many ports of entry into the United States: Boston, Philadelphia, even parts of Atlanta and New Orleans, which is where my ancestors came through to America, not through Ellis Island. So that's another point that's never been discussed or expressed. Okay. No sooner than the 1920s were expressed publicly, people got information, then there was a set in to stop immigration, to at least limit it. All right. They wanted to limit it, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe. They always focused on Europe. They didn't choose anywhere else. For example, they're allowed 155,000 to 200,000 from Northern Europe, but a total of 358,000 to come to America. Remember, at the end of the war, many Europeans, disgusted with the effect of the war, wanted to come here. There were job opportunities, but with the flood of soldiers coming back, there was a contest already for jobs in America. Furthermore, in 1920-21, there was a bit of a depression. Oh, you want to call it recession. That's a kinder word for America. And it did affect people. And there was an attempt to limit the number. All right. You may be interested in how they came about that. They wanted to establish a quota. First of all, 3% of all immigrant country population of the United States of 1910. They wanted to use that level. Okay, that number, 3% of that. Now, 800,000 immigrants attempted to enter the United States between 1920 and 1922. And we only allowed 300,000 a year. Okay. And still, that number did not satisfy a number of people in America who thought America was already too crowded. Now, when you compare our population today to then, it doesn't seem to make much sense. Ironically, the nativists were never satisfied with that number of 300,000. They wanted less. Okay. Finally, in 1924, the McCarran Act, and I won't go to that until I get to that year, they reduced it to 2% of 1890 census, not 1910. Okay. One of the reasons they feared is that all these people coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe would be, the mafia would be coming, and their indolence of Southern Europeans and the Bolsheviks from Eastern Europe. That was the excuse given, but that's not quite what it was. The point is, America was not, the old America before 1870 was not used to this volume of Europeans coming to America, and there was this reaction. Okay, I can go on this. We've never really had a very clear immigration policy, and you know that right now, that's a hot topic politically. And I don't know where it's ever going to go to, whether it's developed. Now there are other places. Europeans are not coming to America as much as they were, or even to Canada. But other countries are interested in coming, particularly from Asia, particularly from South America, Central America, and other parts. Okay. But still, we haven't clarified what our immigration policy could, should, and made sensible. Okay. That's me talking. You understand me? All right. I'm moving on. Okay. What else? Well, 1920, women got the vote and prohibition was, quote, enforced. Well, enforced to a certain extent. The election of 1920, and Jim, can you please bring up the picture of President Harding, who was elected president.
Should be. It's not coming up, Sal. Sorry. Let's see. I don't know why.
Anyway, remember,
Let's see.
life called Word. Well, you're having troubles with that, Jim? All right.
Can you see that?
No,
Okay. Don't know why. Let's. Why don't you just go ahead, Sal?
all right. Well, I want you to know that he was the most, what do you call it, presidential looking man of his day. He was chosen. He's from Ohio. He was governor of Ohio. He had a lot of friends. In fact, he had too many friends. And one of the things he did allow, which most people are not aware of, he did allow liquor to be delivered to the White House in spite of prohibition. Okay, all right, there he is. There he is. There he is a very straightforward looking man, but he was a sick man. I don't know whether you knew this, but he was a sick man. His wife was a very difficult person to deal with because she kept pushing him to be more severe on choosing members of the cabinet. And he chose one of the wrong men for his cabinet, the man who was head of the Veterans Association. He turned out to be a crook, but he was a close friend of Harding, and eventually had to be, was brought to trial and served in prison because he squandered the money that was to be sent from some of the veterans into his own pocket to get him out of debt. Now, these are the things I was reading about, and he eventually found out how many people in his cabinet and friends were taking advantage of his office to win, to win whatever they wanted, particularly in contracts. And of course, the famous Teapot Dome scandal of oil came through, and that was much later, and I'll discuss that when I come to that in that year. But that was the beginning of the problems he had. And the man was literally, he was a bit confused by the office as being president of the United States. I think he was overwhelmed by it. Secondly, and I think this should also be said, is that he was able to be much friendlier to Germany at the end of World War I than we are. He's the one who urged, because I don't know whether Americans knew, we were still at war with Germany. We did not follow the Compiègne Proclamation. So we were not shooting at Germans, but nevertheless, we were officially at war. He went out of his way to end that. That he has to give him credit for that. He died in 1923 in San Francisco at the Fairmont Hotel, and coming back from a trip to Alaska, the first president ever to visit Alaska. All right, Jim, you can take that off now. I'm going to move on here. Women began to get the voting rights. I began and discussed that. Many of them were elected to state legislatures, but very few to the Congress. So it was the beginning of the female role in American government. And now it's pretty much very common. We accept it. And we have a female vice president, first time in American history. Okay, so progress has been made at that time. The whole point of the administration was to get back to, quote, normalcy. And there was, after 1921, there was beginning of a boom in American economics. We were becoming the richest country in the world at that time. Now, you might be interested in knowing this, that the steel production in 1920 was over 42.3 million tons of steel. That's far more than any other country. More so, only Germany came close. Eventually, Russia passed them both. All right. And furthermore, the amount of energy consumed in America was 694 million tons of coal. That was still our principal power source for our energy and our electricity. the total shares in manufacturing around the world, America was 34.4%. We outdistanced the whole of Europe, the whole of Russia, of everything else around the world. We were the manufacturing country of the world. No questions of it. All right, that's it. Now, let me move on this point of this. I think one of the things that was happening at that time was the movement of Blacks from the South in greater numbers to cities like Chicago, Kansas City, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and New York. Another thing that you might be interested in knowing is the fact that at this time, there was a reaction in the South because they were losing their labor force. And so there were organizations trying to stop Blacks from moving away from the South. And you can understand why Blacks moved away from the South. They're trying to get away from Jim Crow. It didn't mean that there was no prejudice in these other cities, but it was a better way of life than in the South. They didn't fear what was going to happen to them if they stayed in the South and opposed what do you call the whole picture of Blacks going through what they had to do in New York. And at the same time, there was, in the same year, in 1922, the rise of the KKK. Jim, will you show us a picture, please?
Why don't you just keep talking and I'll pull it up.
All right, okay. It began as a result of the Red Scare, ironically, at that time. In 1924, they had a reaction to it. And there you see the burning cross, which is a symbol of it. And I have some information that you might find peculiar about this. It started in Atlanta, and it became its headquarters there under Colonel William Simpson, who became the Imperial Wizard. He was a circuit rider for the Methodist Episcopal Church and later professor of history at Lanier University. In 1915 is the year it began, at least in his mind, and the dress of white and hood became standard in 1920. In 1921 in Texas, they got carried away with 43 people and one woman tarred and feathered. It's a favorite form of punishment for this organization. And an 80-year-old farmer was tarred and feathered, as well as in Florida, a deacon in the Episcopal Church was also tarred and feathered. That seemed to be one of the most vicious ways in which they expressed their contempt. Now, it's a paramilitary organization, and the structure was indigenously fascist, actually rooted. They knew what they were against, but they didn't know what they were for. They were for this. Who did they were against? They were against Blacks, immigrants, Jews, Catholics, and they made significant gains in the Midwest, in state legislatures, and even far north as Montana. But their excesses, victimizing by torturing opponents, were their undoing. Okay, corruption and crime turned the public against them. And even though they persisted until 1950s, even I was a teenager, remember hearing about them. They faded from the public view, but they left a critical scar on the American public and on the horizon. It still plagues us Americans. Okay, now there were other elements, even in 1922, that were bad. There were 57 lynchings in America, 6 whites, 51 blacks. This has always been a bad scar in American history. But one thing about our country, more than I think many others, and maybe some are better, we admit it. We did these things. We are an open society. We talk about these things. All right. But there were some positive things as well. I got to tell you this. All right. In 1922, there were 68,488 college graduates. All right. So we increased our educational level. 41,306 were males, 21,362 females. Okay. And there were many doctorate degrees. 708 male, 128 female. So things were not that bad. But another thing that you might be interested to know is the rise of automobiles. Jim, do you want to bring up a picture of our Tin Lizzie or what you can? There we go. The Model T already come in. And there were 2,274,100 cars registered in America in 1922. And it was now in full swing, and over 269,000 trucks and buses. Clearly, the U.S. principal business arbiter now was becoming the automobile industry with all its sub-elements of glass, gas, tires, leather, etc., and everything else. All right, by 1923, 1 year later, we were 3,624.7 million vehicles in America. So this became the great symbol of America, and it still is. People still look to the automobile industry as a sort of an arbiter of what we can produce in America, like industrially. Okay, now there some good news. There was a recession in the 1920s, I said, but it was wiped out fairly fast. Okay, and receding, there was unemployment declined from 11.7 million in 1921 to 6.7 in, percent-wise in 1922. And weekly wages increased from $48 to $50 a week on average. And a family could live on it. But the working hours still didn't go down. There were 44 hours of work per week. And during World War I, the clamps on working hours were fixed, but they were loosened by 1920. And, quote, unions did not have the power to express their concerns to keep the hours of work lower. But they did make some progress on some. And one of the things that happened at this time, and I think we are keenly aware of it ourselves now, is the farming declined. There were 101,169 farms that were active in 1922. They were down to 908,000 in 1922. Farms were now in recession throughout the 20s, and it began year by year by year. Even though Harding did establish a federal farm bureau to assist farmers, it still declined in American history. Now, our GNP in 1922 was 74.1, increasing every year from 1921, which was 69.6. So our productivity was at its peak all during the 20s. This was the golden age of the roaring 20s and America doing what it is. The unfortunate thing is that, prohibition could not work. Americans like to drink, okay? They want their beer, they want their wine, they want their hard liquor. Now, it's interesting to note, my grandfather used to make wine every year. That was part of his hobby, besides curing olives and doing other things. And he was allowed to make 200 gallons of wine a year. One drop more, he would be arrested. So he always had enough to go around for everybody who wants it. Now, it never succeeded from day one. I was amused to find out many Americans used to head for, in Washington, D.C., guess where they went to get a drink? They went to the British Embassy. The British Embassy had plenty of liquor, and they were more than willing to share it with Americans. And there was always a line out the British Embassy to have their daily shot. Anyway, I just want to bring that up as a small point. Okay. Now, another thing that grew up at this time was radio. Radio was entered it very, very little. In the beginning, it was more widely noticed in the early 20s, but it was a new form of entertainment. Information was made much great strides. There were 30 operating stations in 1922 with over 60,000 households with sets. By 1923, there were 556 stations on the radio at that time, and over 466,000 sets in the homes. Clearly, this was going to be a new form of change in American households, and it's never stopped. Everybody thought when the radio came in, newspapers would dry up. Well, newspapers did not dry up, but then there came another form of information, and more Americans became more informed through the use of having radio. I grew up with radio, and that was our form of entertainment when I was a kid. My mother used to do her ironing listening to radio, and that was always something that was part of our household. I thought you'd get this in. Now, that's about as far as I've got covering in American history. The point is, it was a very active year. Things were, quote, getting back to normal at the time. And now I'd like to switch to something else, which is about the international event that happened. Even though we did not join the the League of Nations, we didn't deny our role internationally in roles that we came and played. And things were happening very fast all over the globe as a result of World War I and the 1920s. For one thing, in 1922, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia came to an end, and solidified, and the formal creation of the Soviet Union came into place that year. Lenin was still alive, although he did suffer a stroke that year, lived 2 more years and died then. Okay, well, what happened in 1922 from the early part to the end? And that's what I want to discuss now. And that is the first part is on Ireland. And Jim, would you bring up a picture, please, of De Valera? And there is Edmond de Valera, a very interesting sounding name, more Hispanic than Irish, but that is the man who eventually became president of Ireland. And he spent some time in jail, thanks to it when it was part of the British Empire. The Dáil, I'm not saying it right. I know I can't speak at all Gaelic, but that's the parliament. They made an agreement with the British after many, many years, actually decades of trying to become an independent country. They adopted the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Now, De Valera opposed this. He refused to accept it. And he walked out of it, and he decided to form a new party, or new Republican Party, opposing this. But eventually he came to being the head of the government of Ireland. Now, I might say this. People don't know, even though Britain was on the victorious side after World War I, and she never looked greater, she had acquired so much part of the empire of Germany and of the Ottoman Empire, and I'll get into that later. I want to get into this part about Ireland. England, being on the winning side, was the one country that lost land in World War I. She lost the Irish Republic, the Irish land, except for the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, which fought the unification of Ireland tooth and nail. Okay, now it is still part of the British Empire, part of Britain, even though things are different now. Today, Ireland is still part of the European community, but Northern Ireland is not. Okay, I want to bring this point out because even though they acquired the German colonies, the mandates, and the same thing from the, the Ottoman Empire, as I said, England never looked greater, but she was really a wounded warrior. And it took until 1926 when things got really tight in England and there was a national strike. And I'll come to that when I get to that year. But Churchill was the first to notice that England was no longer able to carry the role it played before World War One. Okay, they had guardianship of, quote, the German colonies, but it really was in effect making it a colony. And same thing with the Ottoman Empire. Now, Germany was, the International Court of Justice was formed in The Hague in Holland, and it's now part of the League of Nations. That's one of the contributions that still exists from the League of Nations. Germany now was told they were given a debt of World War I of $33 billion in 1920 value. So you figure how much that is today. They said they could pay it by selling raw materials or their finished goods, but they never could quite come up paying every year what was required. There was a secret agreement at the same time at the place in Rapallo in Italy where the Germans got together with the Russians, and they made secret agreements to study new weaponry that came from World War I. This was unknown to everybody. They realized something was coming up between the two of them, but they weren't quite clear what it was. They wanted to renew their ability to become a strong nation again. And as we'll see what happened in the 30s. All right. There was also one thing that hurt the Germans, which came as a result of this. They agreed reluctantly to offer the area called Silesia to Poland. And this they objected intensely because it was rich in coal and steel, and it was given over to Poland. All right. The Germans resented that. It's a really upper Silesia was given to them. Furthermore, Walter Rathenau, the one that signed the agreement of the Versailles Treaty, and that he was killed by extremists in Germany. One of the few men that really understood how Germany could recover from World War I and didn't. Arthur Griffith, who had been chosen as president of the Irish Republic, he died, and this is when Valera stepped in. He suddenly died on this. Okay. There are other things that happened at the time. Unfortunately, in the middle of the year, the German stock market exchange began to fall, and the mark fell from 162 marks to the dollar to 700. Now, in 1923, it reached trillion dollars to the dollar, trillion marks. My God, 4.5 trillion. Money just blew in the streets. It was worthless. You couldn't buy a cup of coffee with 1 trillion marks. How did that come about? That's because the French insisted that they pay up full amount year by year. Well, the Germans couldn't do it. French told them, we want it in marks, your value marks. Well, the temptation then is to start printing them. Boom, boom, boom. The machines just went crazy, printing all these marks that became valueless. It took a full 4 years later to kindly calm the whole picture of this event. But I don't think any other country has ever gone through anything like this in its history. Now, to the very rich in Germany, it didn't touch them. To the very poor in Germany, they couldn't do anything about it. It's the middle class that was hit the hardest. They were wiped out. This totally wiped their value. And this is the founding and the basis for the rise of resentment against Versailles and against all components of this thing. Now, I might be beginning to say this, is that I don't know how Germany ever recovered from that. I had a professor at university here in Berkeley who showed me what a 5,000 mark bill looked like. Very attractive. And he has it framed. And I was impressed by it, but I said, can I buy anything with it? He says, not a thing. You couldn't buy anything. So, all right, this is what happened in 1922 in Germany. Furthermore, in Britain, Lloyd George resigned as Prime Minister of England. He lived in 1945. He saw the end of the war. And his two heroes, I might add, were Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. He thought they were among the greatest leaders. I don't know whether he's aware of that, but that's how he felt in the 30s. Now, back to Europe. Mussolini leads a fascist group into Rome at 1922. And everybody said he marched with his troops. Baloney, he arrived by train. He got off the train there, and there was a group of people beating him. A first thing he did, he was invited to meet the King of Italy, who asked Mussolini to form a government. And what Mussolini did was to make sure that his fascist elements were in control of the legislature of Italy. Now, I don't know what happened after this in that country, but he made fascism popular all over Europe. And it's hard to admit that's true, but remember, the effect of World War I was severe in Europe. And so it had, people were seeking solutions, whether it be Bolshevism, whether it be fascism, whether it be continued democracy. It's interesting that two major democracies of Europe, Britain and France, still held on in that role. Okay. Now, that same year I mentioned, Lenin had a stroke. He did some things that were quite interesting in Russia at the time. He did allow farmers to produce goods and sell it at their own, price or what it is, because he needed food desperately. And they had no ability to create food. The food was a great shortage in that time. In fact, there's appeal around the world for food to send to Russia. They had already had battles going on in the Ukraine. The Ukrainians set fire to their farms rather than give food for nothing. People killed their livestock. So Russia was in a very, very tight way. So it is this that happened. Can you show me a picture? No, I don't want a picture of Lenin. We already know what he looks like. But I'd like to go and move from this part on to another area of Europe, not necessarily Europe, but in Africa, where Egypt becomes a monarchy. And you'll see here a picture of Ataturk. I will talk to him about what happened in the old Ottoman Empire. But remember, Egypt was, quote, partially part of the Ottoman Empire, but they created a monarchy, but it was under British protection and British rule. So I kid you not by saying to you, this did not work. Now, what happened in Turkey at this time? Now, I don't know whether many of you are aware, but the Ottoman Empire was very mixed in population. There were, of course, overwhelming Turks, but there were Greeks, there were Jews, there were Kurds. There were all different mixed people in that one empire. And what Kemal Ataturk, whose picture you see there, did was to realize that the Ottoman Empire lost more land than any one of the powers in World War I that lost in that war. All right. So he wanted to make sure that Turkey, as he now wanted to create, would be different. But he was a military man. He was born in Thessaloniki, which is now called Salonika, and that's part of Greece. And he was born actually in Greece, which is part of the reasons with us. But he found the Greeks wanted more land out of the Turks as part of their old Grecian Empire. And there were quite a few Turks living in what they call Anatolia, which is now above that area where that earthquake hit that country now, just right above it, including the city of Antioch and other major cities in that community. They were filled with Greek people. Furthermore, there was a war with the Greeks. And Ataturk went down to that area, finally killed the Greeks out of there, and it was a massacre. when they killed all these Greeks, and they finally came to an agreement that they would exchange populations wherever Turks were under Greek rule and wherever Greeks were under Turkish rule, they would exchange populations. And that was done in 1922. But there were two treaties that affected the Ottoman Empire. And that was the Treaty of excuse me, I'm trying to think of the city. It's just slipped out of my mind. Lausanne came later. This was the early one I'm thinking of. And that was one where the Turks refused to accept it. They would not take it. At Lausanne, they made an agreement with them. And one of the things they agreed was that they were going to internationalize the Dardanelles and that they would protect all minority nationalities in there. Now, one of the things Mustafa Kemal did was amazing, is that he got rid of the Sultan at that point. He dropped the role of Turkey as being the what do you call it, religious head of the Muslim religion. He adopted the Roman alphabet for his people. And above all, he's the first country, if you can believe it, they gave women the vote. And so this is an amazing fact about his role, in that he was determined that Turkey and the new boundaries would make this a new country. Now, there's always been a struggle because there's these minorities there. And I don't know how many of you know, but the Kurds, which were another group in south eastern Turkey, at the end there, is part of 4 countries. They're part of Syria. They're part of Turkey. They're part of Iraq. They're part of Iran. And they almost became a country at Versailles. The British stopped it. And one of the reasons is they remembered how they treated British troops that were defeated at the Battle of Kut, that on their return to the troops, as they marched the prisoners, and they all had to march from that area into prison camps, they were mistreated by the Kurds vehemently. And so that is a memory that stopped them from becoming a country. They almost became a nation. Still today, they're divided on those 4 areas of the world. Okay. Secondly, there was an issue that happened when they created the country of Iraq. Now, there never was an Iraq. It was Mesopotamia. That's the name of it. And Lloyd George thought that was the name of a beer. And it just, that's the way it is. It is never, and they gave that to King Faisal to become that. He wanted to be completely independent. He wanted Damascus to be his headquarters. And they wouldn't, because they gave it to the French. Syria became under French rule. That was part of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. When I worked in the Middle East, when I worked for an oil company, every educated person I met who was from different parts always mentioned the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that it undermined the whole of the Middle East. And to this very day, we're feeling the effects of this. Also in 1922, and I want to bring this up, there was much more clarification on the Balfour Agreement to create the nation of Israel. Now, they had, from the very beginning, a difficulty with this. They didn't want to say nation. They said homeland. They chose that word, a homeland for the Jews and the Jewish people. And this caused some difficulty because they didn't know exactly what you meant by the word homeland. I urge everybody to read a book called The Stakes, Stakes, by an author. His name is not coming up right now. It'll come to me. But it's a brilliant, small, very small book describing exactly the beginning of that and what happened and why it caused the difficulties that are occurring now. I read recently about the solution between the Palestinians and the Jewish element can never be solved. That's a discussion. I don't know what to say about that. Okay. All right. What else happened in 1922? Ironically, at Versailles, the Shandong Peninsula was offered to Japan because of its role there. They gave it back to China, surprisingly enough. The Japanese did return to the Chinese, but China was being racked by civil war and anarchy left and right. They did force the people, the Japanese asked and demanded the right to have great control over the areas that they did have in China at that time. All right, let's move on. In that late fall of that year, there was a Washington conference being held in the USA between Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, agreeing on two things: China's independence as a nation, and secondly, equal rights, access to their markets, and a naval agreement. And it was 553. 5 battleships to Britain, 5 to the US, 3 to Japan. That was the naval agreement at that time. And so, anyway, that is at the end of the year. But there are a couple of other points you might be interested in knowing, is that Niels Bohr got the Nobel Prize in physics that year, and he became one of the most brilliant men in his field. And the second one is that Howard Carter discovered the King Tut's tomb in Egypt. Now, I might say something. Those of you who've been to the World War I Museum, notice that it is typically Egyptian in design. And that was the result of that discovery in Egypt. Now, that's about it. So if anybody got comments, want to nail me, go ahead.
Let me just take over for a second. Is everybody with a question can unmute, but I just have a couple of things to follow up. The dollar around 1918 was 20 to 1. So versus the dollar today is 20 times less than what it was back then. And one of the issues with the treaty is America insisted on everybody paying its debts. And
Right.
Britain and France were debtor nations to America. And as a result, Britain and France demanded Germany to pay. And one of the issues at Versailles was Wilson was asked to forego US debt and he refused. So that's kind of an interesting piece. And one other thing about Black immigration is one of the reasons they headed up to Chicago, St. Louis was all the train connections. The
Yes.
jobs were up north, so they just followed the train. So it was the cheapest way they can get up. And just to go back to your first point, Sal, during World War I, 1914, 1918, at least 100,000 German American men left America to go back to fight for the Central Powers.
Yes.
So that's some of the explanation. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask away.
I don't really have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Alice, I hear you.
Good. One of the things that I do a lot of genealogy work, and one of the things I've come across is about the origins of why Americans hated immigrants, even though we were all immigrants, is that it became a sort of a snob appeal thing that you fought in the Revolutionary War, or if you fought in the Indian Wars before the Revolutionary War, and then all of the revolutionary soldiers had organizations, and they all bonded together over this, and it went on. And the same thing happened after the Civil War. They had all those GAR organizations, and it was a way of bonding, early Americans bonding over them. And then the fear of the other people that were used to living here and not. And early on, when Roger Williams was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and given the worst land possible, which was Rhode Island, he let in all the Jews, right?
Yes.
And so it's ingrained in us, and I think nobody really brings that up, but I think that's certainly a part of it.
There was certainly a racist component towards people from Southern Europe,
Yes, there.
Yes.
Northern Anglo-Saxon.
Oh, yeah.
We had a question about the name of the treaty that gave that area back to China. I know there were 5 treaty names, but I don't know that specific one.
Well, I think it was just called the Shandong Agreement on that, Jim.
Okay.
But there was a very minor thing for the Japanese to give to the Chinese. They still held on to the other peninsula quite effectively. And they always wanted their intrusion into China, and it didn't stop. In fact, to the Chinese and to the Japanese, World War II started not in 1941, but in 1936, if not even earlier.
I'll show my New Jersey background a little bit, is that Harding signed the treaty ending America's involvement with Germany in some golf club in New Jersey, which is right across the street now from a Burger King or something like that.
I have a comment about the point Alice brought up. Aren't we still seeing some of that today? Call it snobbery. We're better than these other people who are now trying to get into our country. They don't speak our language. The religion is different. Their customs are different. And by the way, they'll work a lot cheaper than we will.
Yep, that's how it works.
And I used to, every time I ran into somebody of the Daughters of the American Revolution, I told them my father was a member of the Sons of the American Depression. So that's what I thought about. You're better than I am. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Steve, let me tell you something about this in the immigration. Immigration has made us rich. I think people underestimate the economic positive thing about immigration. Every one of those have to be fed. They have to work. They have to do their things. And, all these comments about people being lazy or they take, minimum jobs and everything else. Who will take them? Name them. Now, look, I grew up in the agriculture area of the Monterey County. We had artichokes. We had the Salinas lettuce fields. Who's going to harvest them? Who's going to plant them? Tell me.
Mhm.
Your next door neighbor? No way.
Mhm.
No way.
They brought a lot of know-how as well.
That's right. They brought a lot of know-how. Yes. All right.
I have a comment
Yes.
about farms and farming. I think that if you had good farmland and you owned it outright without having to share with the bank, in the history of my family, the post World War II time or World War I time was great for farmers. They had to feed Europe, and they did.
Well, there was a great deal of movement on that in acquiring movement, and Hoover still did a great deal of job of buying excess American food. And remember, for every farmer, is interesting, an American farmer can feed close to 20 people, one farmer. But around the world, it's just 1 to 6. And so the productivity of our country is amazing. We rarely had to import food. I mean, we import anything. We import bananas, we'll import coffee, but even those, and sugar, but even those now we are producing, we can do. And I never understood why the farm world always got the wrong end of the thing. And they always seem to be in debt, no matter where it is. But you're right. Farmers who did own their land, did know money, were quite comfortable.
Yeah, they never felt depression.
No, they did not. No, they did not.
Well, until the Great Dust Bowl.
Yes, well, that's one section of our country. I grew up in an area where our biggest problem in California has been water. That's our problem. I mean, our Central Valley can outproduce any part of, in food like you couldn't believe. Central Valley of California. The Santa Clara Valley, I don't know whether any of you know this, the Santa Clara Valley, which is now almost the headquarters of the new electronic age, is one of the richest soils in the world. It's 60-foot thick topsoil. Can you imagine soil being that thick? And it was when I was a kid driving through there, because My family were San Franciscan, even though they moved to the Monterey Peninsula in the early 30s. We always had to go to San Francisco to shop. God bless my mother. But anyway, we always drove through this Santa Clara Valley, and it was all farms, all produce. Now it's all homes. And
Well,
cities.
this may be an oversimplification, but farmers at least had food to eat, whereas the rest of the country, especially during the Great Depression, didn't.
No, it did not.
And I'd spent some time in America's great natural disaster, the Midwest, and I've seen farmers who do very well, whereas some do very well, some do not so well. But generally, I was in North Dakota. There were an awful lot of snowbirds who went to Florida for the winter.
Yes, they do.
So-
A lot
If
of
I could just
Canadian-
cut in for
A
a
lot of
moment.
Canadian farmers too, let me tell you that.
If I could just cut in for a moment, we've got about 3 more minutes to 2:30. And Sal, we can go over if you want, but if there are any other questions, just feel free to ask.
I'll make a quick statement for my grandfather, who was a farmer in the from about 1900 to 1950. And he would tell you that that Hoover, the farmers detested Hoover because he lowered the price of their produce, everything they made. They couldn't, the wholesale farm prices went way down. And my grandfather was trying to feed a family of 5 at that time on the farm. And yes, you could feed your kids, but the prices that you got for corn, for everything, were very low. Farmers hated him. This is Northern Illinois.
Didn't Hoover also introduce a lot of tariffs, which were
Mhm.
counterproductive?
They were,
Yep.
they were tariffs. All right, thank you
we're-
very
we're-
much. all of you.
So-
We're going to punish foreign countries by raising our prices, so they just go buy it elsewhere.
Okay, so Sal, one, I'd like to thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I really learned a lot. I am going to actually stop the recording right now. And if there's any